Now, in terms of industrial impact, moving on to our next slide, you will notice that with the evolution of interchangeable parts in the assembly line, it begins with a model that predates the factory, the old model called put-out work, which was you would have a factor, an individual who would own the component raw materials, and he would give them. For instance, perhaps I would give a seamstress the shirtwaist and then sleeves, which were already kind of pre-made or they were pre-cut at my shop. I would give them this person and they would take them home and sew them together to make a completed shirt and then bring them back to me, and they'd be paid at a piece rate, which means per finished article per piece. And so the assembly line interchangeable parts has its origins in this. And then what you see is the idea is instead of putting the work out, the work stays in under my roof and the worker comes to me and does the job there. Another thing that we see as assembly line production is this increase in printed material, which leads to a broader dissemination of knowledge and literacy. And you remember from your earlier lessons, America was already one of the most literate societies on earth during this point in time. What happens with the printing, the steam engine and the printing press being tied together is you have mass amounts of periodical journals, literature, and books available. And it's no coincidence in some ways that the first American literary flowering takes place during this time. And we'll talk about those authors and some of the artists and that in a separate unit. There's an incentive as well to educate the workforce. The reason being is as the workplace mechanizes, the workforce has to be more educated to deal with the mechanization, to operate the machinery, if you will, as they're doing things that simply haven't been passed to them by a tradesman by watching him do it and working with their hands and imitating that. The new workplace is becoming a more mechanized, technology-centered workplace, which is going to call for a more educated workforce as well. There's also an incentive to diversify this workforce. The idea is for management, is to expand the labor pool as much as possible. If you take these component tasks and break them down and make them small enough, they can be tasks that women can do and that children can do, and they'll be able to do these tasks and be compensated at a lower wage rate than a regular master craftsman, a regular white laborer, or even a regular unskilled immigrant simply coming, fresh off the boat to America, working at a low wage rate. Women and children were paid further down in terms of those wages all through until essentially the 20th century. You did see an unusual thing in terms of the products themselves. The result of the industrial mechanization during this era in the market revolution is that you have an increase in the quality of goods coupled with a decrease in the price of goods. And it usually doesn't work that way. Usually, the higher the quality of the item, the more the price goes along with it. But with manufacturing, you had volume production, which meant that people could make more goods, better goods. And because there are more of them, they could actually sell them at a lower price than the old single produced goods by a master craftsman. Yet there was still vast profits to be had for the corporate factory model along this way. Time also becomes important in a different way. In the agrarian world, time was measured in seasons. Spring planting, fall harvesting, when the first frost is, when the rains will come, etc. In the new model, which is the model that your school operates on today in so many of your classrooms across the country, minutes become more important than seasons. Hours and minutes become more important. The bell schedule that most of your high schools operate on has its origins in the bell schedules that were established in the factories for first shift, second shift, break, lunch, return from break, etc. It follows that entire factory model, that corporate model, and you still see a holdover of that in education today. That's the universe that you as a student sort of operate in, and schools have for well over a century now. Economic and social mobility during this time were also key to why America was the best poor man's country in the world. You did not see a whole lot of true rags to riches stories, people coming from the lowest rung of society who were then at the end of their lives among the wealthiest elite Americans. But there was for everyone an opportunity, even with the labor and even with the de-skilling, to increase their station in life, and certainly to increase it for their children moving beyond that. So you did have gradual upward mobility taking place for most of society during this time. As the economy grew and extended and expanded, it brought all people along with it, a rising tide, lifting all those ships, lifting all those classes of individuals. Now, the transformation of the market also took place in agriculture. You're not yet seeing what we would today call agribusiness, but you're starting to see movement somehow or somewhat in this direction. Similar to change in the shop floor model here. Swap work and barter are in decline. You don't know your customers as well. You don't know the individuals that you're trading with as well, so relations become more business-like. Relations become more cash transaction-oriented, more contractual-oriented, and you begin to have production in the cash economy with specialization involved in what we would today call commercial agriculture. In New England, you would see the farmers that remained sort of doing what we would call today truck farming, growing various mixed vegetables and produce to sell in the cities around them. But New England during this time essentially begins to de-agriculturalize because the agricultural movement, if you will, the agricultural movement begins to shift westward. The old Northwest, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa a little bit. This area becomes the breadbasket of the nation in many ways because it's a far more agriculturally friendly area in terms of climate, in terms of soil quality. And so as a region, that's what also tied these areas together. This became the area of food production in many ways, and the prairie was being opened up, and the three big elements, the historian's famous line on this, the gun, the axe, and the plow, were the three most vital elements to frontier settlement. Axe for clearing the forests and clearing the areas, and the plow obviously for breaking the prairie, the thick loam of the prairie, to break it. The area you see here is among the most fertile soil on earth, and as such, it's a literal and veritable Eden in its own way for the production and growth of agricultural crops. So you have lots of class mobility. You didn't have a lot of tenant farmers or hired hand farmers because so much land was available that a person could start in that position, maybe do that for a few years, and then move on and actually get their own piece of land. So once again, the labor-starved region, this is also the incentive to mechanize, as we're going to see mechanization take place in the farm in a way that it will not happen in the peasant agricultural societies of Europe until far later. Lastly, in terms of the South and crop monoculture, technology plays a key element as well. Eli Whitney, you all know from the cotton gin. It's important for you to know him as well from interchangeable parts and the first steps towards an assembly line. But in 1793, his invention of the cotton gin transforms American economic relations and productive capacity in the South. Slavery had been dying in the South up to the invention of the cotton gin. With its invention, which is a way to harvest cotton, not just harvest it rather, but you pick the cotton, but strip the seeds out of the cotton. One person could clean 1 pound of lint in about an 8-hour time period, which is like the raw cotton without the seeds in it. Once the cotton gin was invented, a person could clean 100 pounds in a day. And doing so now is a way to make slavery pay. And this is when you see the transition. Post-1793, post-1812 is the vast transition towards the South becoming the cotton kingdom. Prior to this, as we'd mentioned in earlier lessons, rice and indigo were really the key crops, and tobacco were the key crops that were grown in the South. After 1793 through the federal period, the great transition to cotton takes place, and with it, the slave crop monoculture that we've seen. The South becomes, in many ways, an economic one-trick pony. They do one thing and a lot of it, an extractive activity involving the growth of cotton for export elsewhere. They don't even deal with the product on their own. That all takes place in England or in New England, rather. So we see then this industrial impact has both rural and urban effects. And those effects in many ways we dealt with in our next lesson, which is going to deal with emergent sectionalism.